November 1918. Europe stops breathing. In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the German delegation signs the armistice. Outside, a continent drenched in blood listens to silence for the first time in 4 years. 16 million dead, cities pulverized, empires, Austrian, Ottoman, Russian, German, reduced to ash. But the silence is not peace, it is anesthesia. In Berlin, the Kaiser flees. Crowds swarm the streets, hungry, delirious, broken. The empire that once marched with mathematical precision now collapses into slogans, revolts, and starving faces. Yet even in defeat, the German soldier returns home not as a man defeated by the enemy, but by betrayal. A myth is born. We were stabbed in the back. It is not a rumor, it is an infection. It spreads faster than hunger. At the same hour, across the Atlantic, President Woodrow Wilson writes words soaked in moral light. A world made safe for democracy. He arrives in Europe promising a new order, a peace built not by gunpowder but by reason. The Treaty of Versailles is to be his cathedral, but what he builds is a machine, a bureaucratic engine meant to regulate nations, to smooth human conflict into paperwork. The League of Nations, the first global system of collective security, and like every machine built without understanding human nature, it will fail exactly as designed. The victors carve maps like surgeons blindfolded. From the carcass of empires, they assemble new nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Hungary, all with borders drawn by diplomats who never saw the soil they divided. And inside these lines, millions of ethnic Germans are left adrift. Versailles was supposed to end nationalism. Instead, it multiplies it. Then came the invoice. £6.6 billion in reparations, an entire economy shackled to guilt. Factories stop, children scavenge. Inflation eats the mark until it becomes worthless paper. And as Germany sinks, the United States retreats back into its oceans, back into its illusions. The League of Nations is born without its most powerful member, a heart built without arteries. Europe drifts into the 1920 seconds like a broken locomotive coasting on the last fumes of steam. Germany experiments with democracy, the Weimar Republic, fragile, brilliant, and hated by those who see in compromise the ultimate humiliation. On its streets, red banners clash with black ones. Communists promise revolution, nationalists promise resurrection. Both promise meaning. The middle has nothing left to offer. From this soil ruined, resentful, modern, a new organism begins to grow. Not an ideology in the old sense, but a system of faith that behaves like a machine. Fascism. Its fuel, humiliation. Its structure, discipline. Its product, belonging. By the time Europe realizes what it has created, the sound of marching boots has already become the new rhythm of modernity. Across the Alps, another veteran, Benito Mussolini, tests the prototype. He fuses nationalism with industrial order, commands with myth, and calls it fascismo. A politics that doesn't argue, it mobilizes. His black shirts march not for policy, but for identity. His speeches roar like engines, built to vibrate the nerves of a generation that has seen too much chaos and wants to feel purpose again. And Germany is watching. By 1923, amid the ruins of hyperinflation, another veteran, Adolf Hitler, steps forward. He is not yet the dictator history remembers. He is a symptom, a failed artist who sees politics not as governance but as engineering the engineering of belief. In the beer halls of Munich, his voice cuts through despair like machinery through silence. And though his coup fails, his book Mein Kampf will do what no bullet can, transform rage into doctrine. Outside, the world celebrates modernity, jazz, cinema, cars, radios. But beneath the lights, something metallic is coiling. The new century promised freedom. Instead, it delivers systems. Economic systems, political systems, ideological systems, all chasing order through control. 1918 did not end the war. It only changed its language. From steel to speech, from artillery to ideology, humanity has entered the age of invisible engines where belief itself becomes the weapon. The war had ended, but Europe had not healed. It had merely reorganized its pain. The machine of civilization, once driven by empires, dynasties, and divine order, was now powered by abstraction. Democracy, socialism, nationalism. Words became engines, and in the vacuum left by monarchy and faith, these engines began to compete for souls. In 1919, the Weimar Republic was born, a fragile experiment, standing on the rubble of the Kaiser's empire. It was supposed to be modern, rational, progressive, but democracy, to a humiliated nation, looked less like salvation and more like surrender. Germany's new leaders wore suits instead of uniforms. They spoke of liberty while signing reparation bills. To a generation of disillusioned veterans, that contrast was intolerable. The street became the new parliament. Political violence turned into routine. The Freikorps demobilized soldiers, turned mercenaries, patrolled cities like ghosts of an unfinished war. They crushed communist uprisings with the same brutality they once used in the trenches. But they were not fighting for policy. They were fighting for meaning, for the right to feel strong again. Every nation in post-war Europe was in crisis. But Germany's collapse carried a special voltage. It was not just defeat, it was the collapse of an entire worldview. For centuries, Germans had believed in Ordnung, order as destiny, structure as virtue. The war had proven that discipline was not enough to save them. Now, discipline would have to be reborn as ideology. Versailles had done something extraordinary. It didn't just redraw borders, it rewired identity. The treaty became the seed of a myth that Germany had been humiliated not by enemies, but by conspirators within. Politicians, Jews, intellectuals, invisible saboteurs blamed for the empire's fall. This was the Dolchstoß legenda, the stab in the back legend. It allowed the nation to reject reality and preserve pride. And pride, in the industrial age, was a combustible material. By 1923, that pride was collapsing into chaos. Hyperinflation devoured the middle class. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost billions 4 years later. People burned money for heat, factories shut down, savings vanished, and trust evaporated. The social fabric began to rot, thread by thread. The Weimar Republic, meant to symbolize rebirth, now embodied helplessness. Out of this paralysis emerged a new psychology, the longing for the strong hand, not just in Germany, but across the world. In Italy, Mussolini had already discovered the formula, the unification of technology and myth. Fascism offered the modern world something religion could not purpose with speed. It was the idea that the nation itself could be engineered like a machine. One will, one leader, one rhythm. The crowd became the piston, propaganda, the spark, and obedience, the fuel. Germany studied Mussolini carefully. The image of black shirts marching on Rome in 1922 was not just political theatre, it was a mechanical blueprint. Power could be reindustrialized, politics could become spectacle, and ideology, if engineered correctly, could transform despair into devotion. This was the context in which Hitler's voice found its echo. He was not an intellectual, he was a converter. He could turn humiliation into voltage. When he spoke in Munich beer halls, he offered something democracy could not: certainty. While Weimar politicians debated, Hitler declared. While they apologized, he promised resurrection. To the unemployed, he offered purpose. To the veterans, pride. To the fearful, an enemy. To the hopeless, a future wrapped in destiny. Every word he spoke carried the rhythm of an assembly line, simple, repetitive, hypnotic. The mind didn't need to think. It only needed to follow. That was the genius of fascism as a belief system. It removed doubt. The fascist imagination reinterpreted the industrial world. Machines were not just tools, they were symbols of unity and power. The factory became the metaphor for the state. Every worker a cog, every cog essential, none permitted to fail. Underneath the rhetoric of national pride lay a philosophy of submission, efficiency over empathy, discipline over doubt. While the democracies debated laws, the fascists built rituals. While liberals sought truth, the fascists sought emotion. The architecture of ideology became literal. Massive rallies, geometric formations, synchronized movement. The Nuremberg rallies weren't political gatherings, They were experiments in psychological engineering. Floodlights, drums, and banners operated like gears in a vast emotional machine. When the crowd chanted Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, it was not speech, it was ignition. But fascism was not born in a vacuum. Its rise was the failure of every other system to offer meaning after 1918. The liberal order spoke of reason, while people starved. Marxism spoke of equality, while Stalin's purges filled graves. Religion spoke of forgiveness, but the new century had seen too much steel and blood to believe in mercy. The modern world had lost faith in gods, and in their absence, it began to worship itself. By the late 1922, the illusion of stability returned. The German economy recovered briefly, American loans flooded Europe, and the factories roared again. But underneath, the ideological pressure kept building. And then, in October 1929, the floor collapsed. The New York Stock Exchange fell, and with it, the fragile illusions of global recovery. 6 million Germans lost their jobs. Desperation returned like a contagion. The republic that had barely survived one crisis now faced another. And this time, the extremist voices had microphones. Hitler's National Socialist Party promised not just change, but revenge. By 1932, the Nazis had become the largest party in the Reichstag. The democratic system had manufactured its own destroyer. Within months, Hitler was appointed Chancellor, the final step in a process that democracy itself had enabled. The machine of modern politics had completed a perfect circuit, from freedom to fanaticism. In the following years, as he consolidated power, Germany transformed from a wounded nation into a weaponized society. The ideology that had once whispered in beer halls now roared through radio waves, posters, and parades. The belief system had become industrialized. It no longer needed persuasion, only rhythm. Because once a people learns to march in unison, they stop asking why. And in 1933, Germany stopped asking altogether. By 1933, Germany had chosen motion over memory. The republic that once symbolized freedom now celebrated obedience. Hitler's rise was not a seizure, it was a synchronization. Every mechanism of society, from the factory to the family, began to tick to the same rhythm, the ideology of unity. But inside that unity lived a paradox, the contradiction at the heart of fascism. It promised power through submission, individuality through conformity, and purity through violence. It demanded that men surrender their doubts so that the nation could become pure. It was the perfect machinery of control, a system that enslaved people in the name of liberation. At first, it seemed to work. The chaos of Weimar vanished. The economy surged. The Autobahn unrolled like arteries of a new civilization. Millions of unemployed Germans found work building the infrastructure of pride. Propaganda films showed smiling workers, children in uniform, farmers saluting the rising flag. The message was simple. The machine works when every gear obeys. But beneath the precision lay corrosion. What Germany built was not an economy. It was a war engine disguised as recovery. Hitler's new Germany was a production line for destiny, with ideology as the lubricant. The contradictions were everywhere. A regime that glorified the worker while enslaving labor, that preached moral order while institutionalizing terror, that spoke of peace while designing panzer divisions. And yet, the illusion held because the world wanted it to hold. France and Britain watched the spectacle with cautious relief. To them, Hitler's Germany was a wall against Bolshevism, a disciplined nation standing between Europe and the chaos of the Soviet Union. Western diplomats applauded his efficiency, his ability to restore order. Few noticed that order without justice is only preparation for something worse. Inside Germany, ideology became architecture. Leni Riefenstahl's camera turned politics into choreography. Albert Speer's designs made buildings into metaphors for eternity. And Joseph Goebbels perfected the technology of persuasion, the use of mass communication to industrialize emotion. The radio replaced the pulpit. The loudspeaker replaced the conscience. The contradiction deepened. Germany was modernizing to return to the past. Hitler's vision was not forward-looking, it was mythological. He promised a rebirth of a mythical Aryan order, an empire of blood and soil. But to create this future, Germany had to destroy everything modern civilization had built: humanism, reason, pluralism, doubt. The fascist project was not anti-modern. It was hyper-modern. It used machines to resurrect myths, propaganda to manufacture faith. It was the fusion of ancient longing with industrial method, the heart of modern contradiction. While Germany prepared its ideological engines, the world outside also shifted. In the East, Japan's military elite began its own version of ideological engineering. Like Germany, it faced humiliation, a nation desperate for resources, bound by tradition, electrified by ambition. In 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria without even informing their civilian government. The League of Nations protested. Japan simply walked out. The machine of collective security, built in 1919 to prevent another war, had just failed its first test. The world had built an institution to restrain aggression, but not the will to enforce it. It was Versailles' ultimate paradox, a system of peace designed without power. Fascism thrived in this vacuum. Italy followed with its invasion of Abyssinia. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Japan signed its pact with Hitler. The mechanisms of aggression reactivated with mathematical inevitability. Each success confirmed the same principle, that weakness was the true sin of the modern world. By 1936, the contradictions had converged. Europe, still scarred by the trenches of 1914, now watched as Spain tore itself apart. The Spanish Civil War became a laboratory of ideology. On one side, the Republican coalition of leftists, socialists, and anarchists. On the other, General Franco's nationalists, armed, financed, and supplied by Hitler and Mussolini. For the fascists, Spain was not about territory, it was about testing the machine. The Condor Legion bombed Guernica, turning a town into a warning. It was not a military necessity, it was a demonstration. The world saw and did nothing. The democracies repeated the same mantra: it's not our war. But it was. Every bomb over Guernica was a rehearsal for Warsaw. Every speech from Franco's balcony was an echo of Berlin. The Spanish Civil War exposed what Europe refused to see, that the ideologies of the 1930 seconds were not politics anymore. They were industrial religions, powered by belief and blood, and the more Europe tried to ignore them, the stronger they became. By 1938, the illusion of containment was over. Hitler annexed Austria in a single day. No shots fired, no protests raised. Crowds greeted him with flowers, salutes, and tears, proof that the ideological machine could now annex minds before it annexed borders. Then came Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain flew to Munich, waving a promise of peace in our time. The world believed diplomacy could still tame steel. They didn't understand. Hitler wasn't negotiating, he was calibrating. Each concession tested the limits of the democratic will. Each silence, each signature, was a gear locking into place. By 1939, the contradiction had reached its final stage. The system built to prevent war had guaranteed it. The peace designed to restrain nations had disarmed them. And the ideology that promised unity had rebuilt the machinery of destruction. Europe was not marching to war, it was returning home to it. The engines that had fallen silent in 1918 were roaring again, fueled not by coal or oil, but by belief. By 1939, the machine was complete. 20 years earlier, the world believed it was dismantling the engines of empire, breaking them apart, purging the iron from politics. But beneath every peace conference and diplomatic smile, another design had been forming, quietly, methodically, without mercy. The fascist world was not born from chaos. It was engineered. This new order did not run on oil or coal. It ran on emotion, on the calibrated combustion of pride, humiliation, and belonging. It was the first ideological system to function like an industrial network. Every citizen became a component, every institution, a gear, every lie, a spark. Truth itself became a product. In the factories of propaganda, Goebbels transformed storytelling into an industry. The press, the radio, the cinema, each was standardized and synchronized, each serving a single rhythm, repetition until obedience. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, sat in millions of living rooms, whispering the same pulse into every home. The Führer's voice became omnipresent not as a message, but as a frequency. Through Riefenstahl's lens, politics became geometry. Crowds moved like circuits, each human body reduced to a pixel of devotion. The spectacle was not spontaneous. It was engineered choreography lines, light, symmetry. Emotion built with mathematical precision. For the first time in history, mass feeling was industrialized. While propaganda manufactured belief, the economy manufactured purpose. The regime's miracle of employment was no miracle at all. It was the assembly line of obedience, millions mobilized under the Reichsarbeitsdienst, building roads, canals, and monuments that all pointed toward war. A shovel became a symbol of loyalty. A hammer became an oath. Every job, every contract, every wage was a step toward militarization. The factory floor became a temple, humming with the theology of productivity. Corporations, once autonomous, fused with the state. Krupp, IG, Farben, Messerschmitt, Siemens. They didn't just produce goods, they produced faith in steel. In their laboratories and foundries, scientists replaced priests, engineers replaced philosophers. Industrial output became moral proof. The purpose of labor was no longer prosperity, it was synchronization. Every machine built was a rehearsal for something larger. Yet, even the most efficient engine needs fuel. Fascism found it in hatred. It turned prejudice into infrastructure, ritualized fear into civic duty. Enemies were no longer defeated, they were defined. Jews, communists, intellectuals, all recast as bacteria in a social body that required purification. Bureaucrats became executioners with pens, issuing birth certificates that determined who was human and who was not. The machine had learned to kill without passion. It didn't need chaos, it needed order. Across the Alps, Mussolini perfected the same rhythm. He called it rebirth, the return of Rome through asphalt, discipline, and will. In Japan, the militarists built their own ideology of transcendence, blending samurai myth with mechanized obedience. The Axis was not a political alliance, it was a shared architecture of spirit, each nation a different instrument, playing the same mechanical symphony. But the system's power did not lie in its weapons, it lay in its philosophy. It convinced millions that obedience was freedom, that sacrifice was purpose, that death itself could be progress. The individual no longer mattered, only momentum did. The train was sacred not because of where it went, but because it moved. Fascism's greatest invention was not the panzer or the Stuka, it was motion without morality. While the dictators orchestrated spectacle, the democracies looked on, paralyzed by their own logic. France and Britain mistook precision for stability. They thought fascism could be negotiated with because they still saw it as politics. They did not realize they were confronting a new species of system, one that no longer required truth to function. Democracy depends on consent. Fascism depends on synchronization. Consent hesitates. Synchronization obeys. That is why Chamberlain's paper, fluttering from his hand at Munich, was already obsolete. The modern world had accelerated beyond diplomacy. The age of conversation had given way to the age of command. The factories that once produced goods now produced emotion. The rallies were not politics, they were rituals of ignition. Each torch, each drumbeat, each uniform was an interface connecting the citizen to the state. The people did not participate in government, they became its current. The architects of fascism understood something the Enlightenment had forgotten. People do not crave reason, they crave belonging. A flag offers what logic cannot: warmth, and fascism turned that warmth into voltage. Speer's architecture transformed space into submission. Massive colonnades, blank walls, eternal symmetry buildings designed to erase the human scale. When one entered, individuality dissolved. Every line pointed upward, toward a void that felt divine. Even emptiness was engineered. Ritual replaced reflection. Ritual required no argument, only repetition. Once repetition was achieved, belief became automatic. The machine no longer needed control, it ran on inertia. By the late 1930 seconds, the system had reached its full design. The Nazi Reich, the Italian Empire, the Japanese Showa state, three engines running on synchronized myths, They were not traditional nations anymore. They were production models of ideology. The League of Nations, built to regulate peace, was powerless before them. It had been designed for words, not for machines. Its reports, its sanctions, its moral protests, all the soft tools of an older century collapsed against the speed of mechanized conviction. When Japan invaded Manchuria and simply left the League, it revealed the truth. Moral systems cannot contain mechanical systems. And once that precedent was set, the contagion spread. Ethiopia fell. Spain burned. Czechoslovakia vanished. Each failure of resistance was another calibration. Fascism was learning. It tested the reactions of its environment like a machine adjusting pressure, and every time the democracies hesitated, it tightened the screws. By 1938, even the concept of war had changed. No longer an eruption of chaos, it was now the logical extension of organization. The annexation of Austria was executed like a railway timetable. The conquest of the Sudetenland, like a logistical delivery. Each operation was proof of the system's perfection expansion without friction. In August 1939, the machine reached its final configuration. The pact between Hitler and Stalin, two ideological opposites, revealed the ultimate principle of fascist logic. Ideology meant nothing beside efficiency. The machine recognized no morality, only motion, and so they divided the world as engineers divide a blueprint. Poland became the testing ground. When the Wehrmacht crossed the border on the 1st of September 1939, the rhythm was flawless. Stukas screamed in perfect formation. Panzers advanced like clockwork. Infantry followed with metronomic precision. Each division moved as if part of a single consciousness. The invasion was not improvisation, it was execution. The modern age had built the perfect weapon. A society that could wage total war without hesitation, without debate, without doubt. As the bombs fell and the world collapsed into noise, the truth of the machine became visible at last. The 20-year peace had not dismantled the engines of conflict, it had refined them. Versailles had not buried the old empires, it had mechanized them. Europe was no longer fighting for ideology. It was fighting ideology as machinery. In the flames of Warsaw, in the roar of panzer engines, humanity confronted its own reflection, a civilization that had converted belief into system, system into obedience, and obedience into annihilation. The industrial century had finally completed its circle, and this time, the product of its efficiency was not progress. It was the end of innocence itself. The machine had achieved perfection. That was its flaw. In 1939, as German engines roared east and the first cities of Poland collapsed into smoke, Europe understood too late that it had not defeated mechanized war in 1918. It had educated it. The industrial system that once built locomotives, bridges, and radios was now building death with the same efficiency, the same precision, the same pride in craftsmanship. For Hitler, war was not an accident of history. It was the final function of the fascist machine. He had engineered a society where every citizen, every institution, every rhythm pointed toward conflict, and when the moment came, the transition from peace to destruction was seamless. Germany did not enter war. It became war. The contradiction that had fueled fascism, order through violence, rebirth through destruction, now turned inward. What had begun as resurrection would end as self-immolation. In the early campaigns, the illusion of destiny held firm. The Blitzkrieg in Poland worked exactly as designed, a choreography of steel and light. French and British leaders watched, horrified, but still paralyzed by the belief that rational negotiation could restrain mechanical will. But war had evolved beyond reason. It now moved at the speed of circuitry radio orders, synchronized tanks, aerial coordination. The same technological logic that once powered assembly lines now organized annihilation. Each front was an experiment in scale. Each victory, a test of efficiency. By 1940, Paris fell not because its soldiers were weak, but because its leaders were outdated men of the 19th century, facing the weapons of the 20th. The fascist system operated like a closed loop. Propaganda to mobilize, industry to arm, terror to discipline, myth to justify. There was no point of entry, no moral leverage, no weak link. Yet the flaw was inherent in its design. A system that runs on motion cannot stop, and when expansion becomes impossible, the machine must consume itself. By 1941, that process had begun. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military operation in history, was not strategy. It was hunger. Germany's ideology demanded conquest faster than reality could sustain it. The system, unable to rest, expanded until it fractured under its own velocity. Factories that had once symbolized resurrection now became mausoleums of exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the image of invincibility, was scattered across burning skies. The armored divisions that had rolled with divine precision now rusted in the snow of the Eastern Front. The machine that promised immortality was dying of overproduction. Meanwhile, the human cost was no longer hidden behind banners and speeches. Cities burned not as symbols but as symptoms: Coventry, Rotterdam, Warsaw. The myth of order dissolved into the chaos it had always contained. And within Germany itself, the contradiction devoured its children. The Gestapo hunted the very people who had built the system. Scientists who engineered progress now built camps. Bureaucrats who preached order now filed death certificates by the millions. Fascism had promised to replace chaos with harmony, but in truth, it had only displaced it. It had moved chaos inside the machine, where it could not be seen, only felt. When the war turned against Germany, propaganda did not adjust to truth. It simply accelerated. The louder the lies, the faster the collapse. Goebbels' broadcasts no longer sought belief, they sought anesthesia. The people no longer trusted the words, but they needed their rhythm to survive. The machine continued to function even as its creators understood it was doomed. That was its most terrifying quality: its indifference. Industrial civilization had always believed that control was salvation, that with enough order, humanity could master chaos. But the fascist experiment proved the opposite. When control becomes total, chaos becomes internal. When the machine can no longer distinguish between creation and destruction, it will build both with equal precision. By 1943, the world had seen its true face. The same steel that built bridges now forged cages. The same logistics that once fed cities now organized genocide. It was the rational mind turned inside out, the perfection of means, the bankruptcy of ends. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the myth of the invincible Reich cracked. The frozen soldiers, once symbols of racial superiority, became relics of a broken belief system. For the first time, the machine hesitated, and in that hesitation, humanity glimpsed the truth: that no ideology, no matter how disciplined or beautiful in design, can defeat entropy. By 1944, the echoes of the First War had come full circle. The same trains that carried soldiers to the front now carried civilians to the camps. The same factories that once built cars now built crematoria. The same engineers who drew plans for progress now drew blueprints for oblivion. The collapse was not a moment, it was a revelation, a recognition that modernity itself contained its own apocalypse. When Berlin finally burned in 1945, the smoke rising above the Reich Chancellery was not just the end of a regime. It was the end of an illusion, the belief that systems could save us from ourselves. Because every machine built to control chaos will eventually need chaos to survive. And when it no longer finds an enemy outside, it will turn inward. That was the final paradox of the fascist century. The more perfectly it ran, the faster it died. The more complete its order, the more violent its disintegration. The same discipline that built the Autobahn led millions to their graves. The war did not destroy fascism. It only revealed what it truly was, the logical conclusion of an industrial age that mistook precision for meaning. And when the engines fell silent, when the banners burned, and the cities turned to ash, the world realized that the enemy had never been a nation, a flag, or a man. It was the idea that humanity could mechanize belief, that emotion, once quantified, could be controlled. That is the collapse, not the fall of an empire, but the awakening from a dream of control. When the dust settled over Europe, the silence that followed was not peace, it was recoil. Factories stood intact but haunted, chimneys still standing over the memory of smoke that was not industrial but human. The war had ended, but what it revealed could not be unlearned. For the first time in modern history, mankind had seen its own reflection, not in art or faith, but in mechanism. The century of progress had built its cathedral and worshipped the machine inside. Fascism had not appeared from nowhere. It was the inevitable offspring of a civilization that believed order could replace understanding, that structure could replace soul. The industrial age had taught humanity that anything could be built if the process was efficient enough: bridges, nations, ideologies. But what no one asked was whether everything should be built. The deeper lesson of the fascist collapse was not about politics, it was about design. When a system is optimized for control, it inevitably begins to consume the human beings inside it. Efficiency without empathy becomes violence by default. The 20th century had transformed every aspect of existence into an equation: productivity, profit, power. The result was a civilization capable of producing abundance and annihilation in the same motion. The same science that cured disease also built gas chambers. The same communication networks that carried music also carried propaganda. Progress had lost its direction. The engine no longer asked where it was going, only how fast. That is the essence of the industrial paradox. The machine does not know when to stop. It has no moral memory, only momentum. The fascist experiment merely exposed this truth at its most extreme. It took the logic of industry standardization, obedience, performance, and applied it to the human soul. It transformed individuality into data, morality into schedule, emotion into fuel. The collapse of the Reich was therefore not just the end of a government. It was a philosophical reckoning. Civilization itself had to confront the realization that progress, when stripped of humility, becomes predation. For centuries, the West had told itself that technology was neutral, a tool, not a doctrine. But the 1,930 seconds proved otherwise. Every tool becomes ideology when wielded long enough. The assembly line is not just a way to build, it is a way to think: sequential, efficient, impersonal. The bureaucrat's desk and the engineer's drawing board belong to the same order of mind. Both reduce complexity to parts. Both prize precision over ambiguity. And ambiguity, the ability to doubt, to hesitate, to ask why, is what makes us human. Fascism's genius was to remove that ambiguity, to replace the burden of freedom with the comfort of certainty. It promised a logic so pure, so total, that individuals no longer needed to think, they only needed to obey. But obedience is not peace. It is the silence that precedes collapse. After 1945, the ruins of the fascist world forced philosophers, scientists, and engineers to face a question more terrifying than any weapon. What is the purpose of progress, when humanity itself can no longer define it? The rebuilding of Europe was not only physical, it was existential. Cities rose again, economies recovered, but something had shifted in the cultural core. The West became cautious, almost apologetic, as if aware that civilization had crossed a threshold it could never return from. The new age, the atomic age, the digital age inherited the same machinery, but with deeper anxiety. The lesson was not forgotten. When systems become absolute, they turn inward and devour themselves. And yet, even as the world declared never again, the structure of the modern world remained industrial in spirit. Governments still measured power in output. Corporations still prized expansion. Ideologies still promised efficiency. The shape of fascism had been defeated, but its architecture lingered invisible, normalized, embedded in how societies organized themselves. We still speak of growth as destiny. We still design systems that reward obedience over reflection. We still build machines faster than we can understand them. The danger of fascism was not its symbols, the flags, the salutes, the speeches. It was its method. It proved that with enough coordination and repetition, any idea can be made irresistible. It proved that the human spirit can be engineered, and that lesson, though buried beneath rubble, remains one of the most unsettling truths of modernity. Civilization's strength does not lie in its machines, nor in its governments, nor in its armies. It lies in its capacity to resist its own designs. The power to build is meaningless without the wisdom to stop. The age that followed 1945 tried to recover that balance through democracy, through international law, through philosophy. But none of these were guarantees. They were reminders that progress must be questioned, that technology must be governed by conscience, that ideology must serve humanity, not the other way around. Every generation since has faced the same temptation, to believe that control brings safety, to think that order is the cure for chaos. But the ruins of Berlin still whisper otherwise. Order without humanity is just machinery, and machinery, left unchecked, will always return to its purpose, to consume, to perfect, to repeat. That is the industrial philosophy written in the ashes of the 20th century. The same hands that forge engines can also forge destruction. The same intelligence that organizes life can also mechanize death. And every system, no matter how rational, must be answered by something older, softer, unquantifiable conscience, because without it, every machine, sooner or later, becomes its own god. The war ended. The cities were rebuilt. The factories roared again, but the echo of the machine never stopped. It lived in the hum of the power grid, in the discipline of schedules, in the architecture of offices and ministries. Humanity had survived the flames, but not the logic that created them. The industrial mind, efficient, ordered, precise, endured, disguised as normalcy. Europe told itself that it had been cured, that fascism was an anomaly, a fever dream of madness and hate. But the machine had not been madness, it had been clarity, a terrifying form of reason stripped of mercy. It had shown what happens when civilization runs perfectly, without resistance. In the ashes of the Reich, the world rebuilt not only its cities but its systems of control. Now they were gentler, subtler, hidden behind bureaucracies and corporate chains. The uniform became a suit. The orders came through policy instead of propaganda. The crowd no longer saluted, it consumed. And yet, the pulse was familiar. The rhythm of obedience had only changed its soundtrack. The 20th century ended, but the design persisted. Progress as creed, control as virtue, technology as salvation. The belief that speed equals success, that data equals truth, that expansion equals meaning. The fascist machine had fallen, but the industrial one had learned. And so the question remains not for Germany, nor for Europe, but for every civilization that inherits the modern age. Can we create systems that serve us, without allowing them to replace us? The world today is quieter, cleaner, more connected. But the silence of the machine is deceptive. Its hum is constant, shaping the way we work, communicate, even dream. Algorithms have replaced rallies. Networks have replaced parades. Information flows faster than any ideology ever could. But the principle is the same. Synchronization disguised as freedom. Each generation believes it has outgrown the past. Each believes it can use the machine without becoming part of it. And each time, the echo grows louder. The lesson of 1918 to 1939 was never about nations or generals. It was about systems. About what happens when a civilization forgets that the soul cannot be engineered. When the machine becomes perfect, humanity becomes irrelevant. In the ruins of Berlin, amid the cold wind of 1945, there were men who understood this truth. Engineers, soldiers, philosophers, standing among wreckage that had once promised eternity. They saw what happens when belief becomes blueprint, when progress loses its purpose, when control becomes destiny. That echo has never faded. It hums beneath the modern skyline, in the thrum of data centers, in the steel breath of engines and drones. It reminds us that every age of invention carries within it an age of obedience. The machine does not die. It waits. It listens for the next generation of dreamers, idealists, and engineers who will once again believe they can master it. And if they do not learn the lesson written in ash, it will awaken not as fascism, not as empire, but as something colder, a civilization that no longer remembers why it builds. The echo of the machine is not a sound, it is a question. And it will follow humanity until the last factory stops, the last algorithm sleeps, and the last human remembers what the machine could never understand, that order is meaningless without conscience, and that the truest progress is the courage to stop.